Tonight our guest kind enough to come back yet again to Georgia Tech because he knows Georgia Tech very well. He graduated in 1990. Now Gene, our speaker tonight, it's actually a treat to have him because he's an Atlanta native. He's also a Georgia Tech graduate. He has an impressive background, and this is a guy who was sort of linked in a triangular way the European operation of a company with China. He has also developed some pretty sharp skills in the complexities of cross-cultural management. His expertise lies in the field of China, broadly speaking. Many cultures wrapped into one. Make sure to really convey the complexities of dealing with Chinese business context, whether it's in the context of a negotiation, or in the context of conflict resolution, or in the context of having multinational, diverse teams working from a Chinese base, always Chinese clients or users or suppliers. You live in Shanghai.
I live in Shanghai.
So it's not exactly an overnight flight.
It's exactly an overnight flight. We're here today to really discuss a mindset for China business. So everybody here is a leader or an executive at a firm or a company, and I think it's very unlikely these days that you don't have some interaction with customers or suppliers or coworkers in China. So whether you're sent to China to develop new business opportunities or you're based here and you deal with Chinese who come to the US, I think it's very important that we all develop what I call a mindset for China business. So to give you a little bit of background, I currently work as an independent consultant. So last year I did a project for Celeron, which is a division of Hitachi Consulting, and I did a 40-week project in Nanjing, China. And the client was a Dutch company, which is also in a joint venture with a Chinese state-owned enterprise, which is Sinopac. So I spent 40 weeks last year in China teaching local Chinese people how to have effective meetings, coaching Chinese people on behavioral changes, and leading a commercial excellence work stream, helping them implement a key account management strategy. And one of the things that really keep on coming through is what are the real cultural differences in how you communicate and manage your interactions with Chinese people. I'm native to Georgia. I was actually one of the few people who are in Georgia who was actually born in Georgia. As Dr. McIntyre said, I did an ME degree at Georgia Tech and also did my MBA at Georgia Tech. And I've been doing business in China since 1996. And one of the things that gives me an advantage of working in China is I'm also bilingual. To learn how to do business in China is really about two things. It's about knowledge and it's about experience. And there is no way, I think I've only been given 50 minutes for this talk, there's no way to transfer... Yeah. So there's really no way to transfer knowledge and experience in this short amount of time. So what I'm also going to do throughout this presentation, and I'll provide you these slides at the end, or I'll provide them to Dr. McIntyre, is if you're interested in China business or interested in learning more about China business, there's a lot of books. If you do a search on Amazon, China business, you get 60,000 return entries. I've read probably 30 or 40 different books on how to do business in China, about Chinese culture, and a lot of the things that I'm teaching or talking about are not original, but they all get repackaged in different ways to try to help people who want to learn about China business better understand how to interact with Chinese. And one of the things that has enabled me, and this is one of the introductions of this book called The Chinese Mind, is being fluent in the language really helps you learn about the culture, because it gives you the tone and the flavor, and language really the doorway of understanding the culture. So I've been, like I said, working in different parts of China since 1996, and through this experience, I've always been challenged with how do you articulate what the person in China is thinking in a context that my boss in the United States or in Germany would actually understand. And all this experience that I've accumulated since 1996 comes down to developing a framework and putting things in the proper cultural context. So I don't think we need to answer this question, why is China important? I think everybody knows why China is important. Now, when I first was invited to be a guest speaker in 2007, also for this International Business Environments class, maybe China wasn't as important as it is today. But I don't think I need to convince anybody in this room that China is important. I don't think anybody who's doing business or keeps on top of geopolitical affairs doesn't believe that China is important. So we're going to skip this. I'm not going to put up a bunch of statistics about how many people are doing what in China and how much meat they consume and all of that stuff. We're just going to go straight into kind of, all of you here are non-Chinese. So the question is, in order to develop the right mindset for working with people on the other side of the Pacific, you have to really first assess, what do you think of when you think of China? Leonardo, what is your perception of China? When you think of China, what pops into your mind?
Well, thank God I have the experience to work with people in China. And to be honest, the first thing when I just say China is like, for me, in my mind is like how different it is to work with them compared to work with guys in Latin America or in North America. Mm-hmm. It's just a totally different culture. Mm-hmm. For me. So when I receive an email and I know it's coming from one of my colleagues in China, I know that my mind is, I have another way to work with them.
Mm-hmm. So you being from a Latin American culture probably gives you an advantage of working with Chinese culture, because most people who come from a country outside the United States have to eventually figure out, how do I deal with what we call Western business people? The Europeans, the Americans, how do we do business with Americans? So you kind of already start to develop a framework and a mindset that, well, the country that I'm from is a little bit different. So when Americans are more direct or Americans are more arrogant, I kind of understand that that's part of their culture. It's a little bit different than ours, but there are these differences that I have to reconcile. Does anybody else want to, Carlos, what do you think of when you think of China? And why does doing business in China become a challenge for people who are non-Chinese?
Having worked in China myself, I found that the human resource is tremendously intelligent. Mm-hmm. I think where sometimes my peers have struggled is maybe thinking outside the box, so they can be brilliant at book smart per se, but yeah, when you try to expand that into a broader thinking, big picture thinking, I think that's where we struggle a little bit. But other than that, nothing but phenomenal things to say about China.
Yeah, China is huge in almost every respect. So I've just put some random pictures, because one of the things that I'm going to talk about is when you want to take your journey into China and really start to understand China, you'll start to realize that China is really what I call a land of contradictions. So this is one picture of China, which in 2008, they welcomed the world to the Beijing Olympic Games. Welcome, my friends. So this is China, a very welcoming country, a very open country, a very almost kind of, you feel like it's a westernized country with all of the, all of the different things going on with finance and economics and movies and sports and stuff like that. And then there's another picture of China where in the background we understand that China is a single-party system. It's still, I guess, technically a communist country, which back in the Cold War era meant a lot more than it probably does today. But we don't often think of China as communist until we really start to interact or see some of the political issues that are happening with regards to China. China is a very modern country in many respects. If you go to Shanghai or you go to Beijing, you see all these very tall buildings. I think most of the tallest buildings in the world now reside somewhere in China. They're no longer here in the US. But we also think of China as tremendous environmental challenges. This is a recent picture of Beijing, where the smog is really like this on a daily basis. So when you form your picture of China, it's just many, many different facets of China that you have to grab a hold of. And as you develop your strategy, or you develop your own personal mindset on how you want to do business with China, you have to keep all of these factors in mind. Of course, you have a lot of athletes now coming from China. Yao Ming is probably the most famous coming from China. China is also one of the world's worst polluters. So it's not only the smog that affects people who live and travel in Beijing, but these are pictures come out of China everywhere. All of the coal burning facilities, all of the massive chemical plants that are just really contaminating the food, contaminating the water. These are big issues in China. They're not often publicized because the state media is still controlled by the government, but if you live in China, you're really concerned about these things. One of the things that Chinese people buy when they travel outside the United States is milk, because contaminated milk is one of the things that more affluent Chinese couples don't want their children to be drinking domestically produced milk or milk powder. And so every time Chinese travel overseas, they buy milk powder. And a lot of these countries in Asia, like New Zealand or Australia, they actually restrict the number of, because their own children can't get milk powder because the Chinese tourists are buying them all. So these are the many different pictures of China that you have to keep in mind. It's not China is this huge manufacturing machine or whatever. Of course, you have action stars, movie stars coming from China. This is also a picture of China. That's, this is the key point here is that China is really many, many different faces. And how you choose to understand China is a decision that you're going to have to make as you begin to form your strategy on how to interact and deal with Chinese stakeholders. So whether you're trying to develop a strategy to sell products in China, or whether you're negotiating with suppliers from China and trying to get the best partnership deal, these are all things that you have to keep in mind as you formulate how do I want to communicate with the person on the other side of the Pacific. So like I said, China is really a land of contradictions. So from province to province, from first-tier city to second-tier city to third-tier city to fourth-tier city, from all the special administrative zones and the free trade zones that have been created throughout China, China is actually not homogeneous. So you'll hear a lot of experts talk about if you want to develop a China strategy, it's probably 10 or 15 different strategies, and depending on what you want to do. Because what happens in the first-tier cities is completely different from what happens in the second and the third-tier cities. And that's where a lot of multinationals lose their competitive advantage. Because when companies first go to China, they usually have some type of technology advantage over China. But they don't have the contacts or the guanxi relationships or the marketing infrastructure to really target the second-tier cities and the third-tier cities. So they just go after the big other large multinational customers in the first-tier cities. But what happens is the domestically growing competitors, they have an advantage in the second-tier cities and the third-tier cities. So they're growing from the bottom up. And if you don't adapt your strategy, then eventually you're going to encounter very, very strong Chinese competitors. As the Chinese government is also continuously doing things to give local Chinese companies an advantage. And another reason is because most of the local Chinese companies have ownership stakes that are part of the state-owned enterprise. So it's all like one big conglomerate, China. This is the second of what I would say is a recommended reading if you really want to learn about China. This is about the Chinese Party. So one of the things that's very interesting is China, based on thousands of years of culture and heritage, is really different than Western culture in one fundamental aspect. It's really, in the United States, I know a lot of you are from different countries, but here in the United States, it's all about individual rights. It's all about me as an individual What are my wants? What are my desires? What are my rights? In China, it's more about collectivism. It's more about society. Based on thousands of years of culture derived from Confucianism, it's all about social harmony. It's all about what works in the hierarchy of the emperor and on down to the father and the son and the family and the community. So what's right and wrong is different than what you would perceive as right and wrong here in the West. So as you're developing your understanding of China, what you start to find out, in addition to the pictures that I showed at the very beginning, is that China is always just an endless line, an endless stream of what you would appear to your Western mind or your non-Chinese mind as contradictions. You know, the party that's currently in power was once a revolutionary party. You know, they overthrew the nationalist Chinese government that's now part of Taiwan in 1949, but now this Communist Party, or this party that's in China, has now become the establishment. It was once a rise up against the corruption of the nationalist government, but now, according to Western definitions of corruption, China is just riddled with corruption. Everything in China would seem to be corrupt based on Western standards. You know, I don't need to go through all of the different things, but what you'll find out in this book is the number one priority of the party that's currently in China now is to keep the party in power. Right? Single party government. That's why they always talk about social stability. Everything that happens that's driven by the Chinese government is really to keep the party in power. All of this, you know, all of the issues with Japan, with the Diaoyu Islands that are in conflict, you know, the riots that happen, it's all to keep the perception of the public focused on China nationalism. You know, the Chinese people, if you talk to Chinese people, especially in the second-tier cities and the third-tier cities, they all complain about their quality of life. They all complain about the corruption of the government officials and the differences between the haves and the have-nots. But at the end of the day, they're very, very nationalistic. So anytime there's a global issue or a global conflict with Japan specifically, everybody rallies around the Chinese government. And so a lot of these things are created to keep China the way it is and to keep the current parties, political parties that are currently in leadership positions where they are. So it's all created to maintain the status quo in China. So I think this is also a very interesting read. It really talks about the different aspects of the Chinese Communist Party that, ironically enough, even in China, they don't refer to themselves as communists anymore. So China is probably the most successful communist regime or government in the history of the world, and they don't really use the word communist anymore, because now it's all about how do you maintain social order, how do you maintain social stability in the country. So instead of getting into too much history or too much statistics, the real point of today's talk is, as individual business people, what do I need to learn, what do I need to know, and what do I need to prepare for in my interactions with Chinese, whether it's customers, suppliers, government officials, employees. How do I prepare myself with the right attitude, with the right mindset to actually be successful? And what I've developed over my 15 years of working in China, always being a language and cultural bridge between stakeholders in Europe or the United States and in China, is the first thing we have to do is we have to put everything into a cultural context. So what does that mean? That means we have a Chinese cultural context. And this is all centered around Chinese culture. And most of the words that you think about in Chinese culture, guanxi and all that, you've all heard them before. So today we're going to really put meaning to these terms and help you form or understand the Chinese cultural context, which is basically the Chinese perceptions, their values, and their mindsets. And this will actually give you the Chinese mindset. So today what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop our own mindset for China business. So the first thing we have to do is understand the Chinese mindset and how Chinese people perceive things through their cultural lens. Because what this ultimately drives is this drives their business and their cultural norms, and it also drives, especially during negotiations, their tactics and their strategies. And of course, what we perceive becomes our perceptions, and in many cases it becomes our misperceptions. And then we will respond with our responses and our interactions. So today we're really going to try to understand Chinese culture in the right context of how do we form our opinions, how do we modify our attitudes and behaviors to be able to more successfully interact with Chinese stakeholders. You know, this is not only something that I've observed in my 15 years of working in China, but of course, Hofstede, who's done the cultural dimensions, you can see that China and the United States are basically on opposite ends of the spectrum as far as individuality. So this is a really interesting point.